Hi, my name is Andrea Zanin. I am a kink educator and writer and blogger and scholar. And I'm probably the least connected to the theater world of anybody that's speaking today, and probably most of you in the room too, which is an interesting position to be coming from in this context. And I hope that maybe that's why what I have to say will be interesting, because it's outside. Cross my fingers. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah? Okay. So thanks a lot to Christina for bringing me in. I saw the play on Friday night, and it was wonderful and fascinating. And I started thinking, as I was prepping for this, of what connections I could draw between what I had just seen and Kink and metoo, and it felt like so many moving parts to try and link together in any coherent way. That what I sort of figured is that rather than try to make this connection between kink and theater or kink and this particular story or anything else, rather than do that outright, I mean, I'll reference it a couple of times, but I think it's a much bigger and more theoretical conversation than maybe we want to have today, because there are so many overlaps or connection points. We can talk about roles, we can talk about real versus play, we could talk about boundaried spaces, we could talk about scripting versus improvisation, and all kinds of other things. But rather than do that, I'm going to just sort of let you think about the connections that you hear or see as I throw material at you that I hope you will find relevant and interesting in the broader context of Me Too and consent and living in North America in 2018 and beyond. So there's my there's my contextualization. Thank you. So when I educate about kink or BDSM, most people want to start by talking about sort of what it is. You know, what is BDSM? And so I usually throw out the acronym, right? B, D, S, and M, and I explained that it's a triple acronym. So B and D stand for bondage and discipline, D and S stand for domination and submission, or dominance and submission, and S and M stand for sadism and masochism. We all have various ideas about what all those things mean, and we can think about them and talk about them in all kinds of ways. But effectively, it's just kind of a grab bag of sexual pathology that was understood, that was sort of categorized as being outside the norm or weird or unhealthy or sinful or wrong, you know, in the late 1800s. And that's sort of why they're all mushed together today, right? In truth, people who are interested in one or more of those letters might have no interest at all in the other ones. They may or may not connect with each other. Those things may or may not happen in the same spaces. And as such, I sort of say, like, take it, like, you know, remember this acronym, it's going to show up a lot, but you don't need to pick it apart too much, because, you know, when people get together because they're interested in doing a thing, they're not going to be like, so, are you into the D, but like the second kind of D? Like, that's not the conversation that happens, right? So, you know, it's good to have in the back of your mind, but it's not like super relevant up front. So what I try to talk about instead is what I call the 3 Ps. And those are power, pain, and fetish, which is not a P, it just helps me remember. I mean, I guess you could get creative. But so when we talk about power, we're talking about desired and consented to and negotiated power differentials, right? Whether it's for a 20-minute experience that you want to have with someone, or for a weekend, or for a larger relationship. The idea is that when we're talking about power, it's power that's being done on purpose and for pleasure, for mutual pleasure, right? Whatever that might look like, whether it's you know, playing a sexy role, or whether it's how you develop a whole relationship. Pain, we're not talking about like stub your toe or have the stomach flu pain. We're talking about intense physical sensations that in other contexts maybe you wouldn't enjoy at all. But when someone's doing it in a way that is paying attention to you and your desires and your enjoyment, or vice versa, it can actually be a wonderful physical experience. So even though the word pain doesn't exactly apply, although sometimes it does, this is another big conversation for another day, right? And when we talk about fetish or fetishism, we're talking about eroticizing everyday, how would I put this, objects, body parts, features that are not classically considered to be genitally sexual, right? So footwear or certain fabrics or any number of other things. What I find most fascinating about fetishism is that human beings can fetishize just about anything. It is so fascinating to just see. I have read about, met people who fetishize everything from a beautiful manicure to a piece of classical music to the sensation of rain on wet jeans. I mean, like, it's so broad, right? And you can't just tell by looking necessarily what someone's experience of the tactile world around them is, right? So that's the definition that I work with, or the sort of set of concepts I work with when I teach a sort of kink 101. In BDSM and kink culture, the idea of consent and negotiation is huge. We talk about it all the time. It's a giant emphasis on it in workshops, on any website, in the how-to manuals and books that are about kink. And I find this really fascinating, and I was going to mention this later, but I think it's most relevant now. I find this really fascinating because the idea that you have to do so much careful negotiation and so much intense discussion about what consent is and how we're going to figure it out between the two of us or the bunch of us, it's sort of premised on the idea that kink is really dangerous. So you need to be having these bigger conversations or these deeper, more intense conversations about consent because otherwise the risk would be so much higher, right? And I actually want to push back on that idea a little bit because by and large, the vast majority of kink practices are actually not all that risky. I'm not saying they aren't risky. I'm saying that relative to any other kind of, for instance, sexual practice or sports or, any other thing, the risks are, I mean, the things that can happen to you on a hockey rink are so much more intense and more likely to land you in the hospital than most of what you would see in a kink setting, right? And I'm going to just get super real here for a second. You can literally die from the consequences of heterosexual penis and vagina sex. You would have to try very, very hard to kill someone with a spanking. Do you see what I'm saying? There's just this, there's a conceptual differential here that it doesn't necessarily hold up in real life. And partly that's me sort of saying, let's demystify kink a little bit, but partly it's also me saying, and you probably need to negotiate those other things way better too, right? So I'm just sort of looking for an equalization here. Now, in BDSM communities and settings, are these consent practices done well? Sure, sometimes. Not always. Just because we talk about it a lot, just because we sort of drill ourselves in consent and negotiation practices doesn't mean everyone does them well, and it doesn't mean that there are no consent violations that happen within kink communities. In fact, the conversation about specifically how that happens in the BDSM world and broader kink settings has been happening for, I would say, easily a decade now. And there's lots of interesting stuff that's been written on it because I think I don't know, maybe the 80s, there was an enormous amount of, community rhetoric that was established to push back against the idea that kink is evil, right? So the line became, well, everything we do is fine because it's consent-based. And that was a sort of really strong political position that a lot of kinky people took. And it's not exactly wrong, but it doesn't leave a lot of room for self-critique. Right? So I think that the BDSM world is doing a lot more self-critique over the last decade, in my observation, than it used to in the past. And so there are a lot more conversations about how to make an event space safe. What kind of rules do you need to put in place? What kind of mechanisms do you need to have so that if something goes wrong, people feel supported? And this is like, I mean, listen, I'm talking to you for 20 minutes, right? Or what, 18 or something? So, so I'm not going to get into all of the ways that that's been happening, and I'm not even sure. My view on it is that we're still sort of early in the process, which I think is true of a lot of places, not just kink, but I think we're sort of early, and I think that what I would have to say about this topic would be really different 5 years from now than it is right now, just as a general idea. And so why is it that even in places where we talk about consent all the damn time, why is it that there are still problems? And my answer to that is because real life never disappears. Kink, like theater, is not a magical set-apart space where somehow, because we have certain practices or language or skill sets, the larger structures of social power and privilege just sort of fall away. That's not accurate, right? So, and we saw this is one of the big things I saw in the Philosopher's Rice. I was like, oh, look, there's power relations inside power relations, inside other power relations, and they're all, so depending on what lens you're taking, you can see how things are playing out in distinct ways. So I'm going to segue into talking about people who violate consent for just a moment. And this is me. This is based on some reading, mostly observation. It's sort of a theory in working theory in my head, but it seems to be useful in my head at least for framing certain ways things happen. So I'm gonna break it down into sort of 3 different types of folks who tend to violate consent or who may violate consent. And the first kind, or the first group, I would describe as being genuine accidents and misunderstandings, right? So this is folks who, they do something, they misunderstood, they got it wrong, they didn't know how to do a thing properly, it hurt someone, they feel terrible, they try to make amends, they apologize, they repair, they take responsibility, right? Consent education as a sort of practice, which is really common in the kink world, will usually reach these people. It gives them some language, it gives them negotiation techniques, it gives them safety techniques to help prevent these things from happening, right? So that is a place where the kind of heavy emphasis on consent education that we have in the kink world is useful, right? The second group of people is quite vast, and I would describe it as folks who, they just don't notice or don't especially care. And this isn't people who are going out of their way to harm anyone, but they're people for whom whatever's going on in their own head, their own experience, their own embodiment is so big and so loud that it sort of drowns out what the other person's experiencing. So they don't tend to listen or pay attention very carefully, and they tend to be a little self-centered, and they tend to have a hard time owning up to their mistakes. And this group of people, I think consent education can reach them, but they may take it in only partially, or it may evolve over a long time. And for these folks, what's important about continuing to do consent education and talk about consent practice is that it reaches their partners and makes their partners feel validated in setting their boundaries or recognizing that something has gone wrong, right? So consent education is still useful, even if it might be more indirect in this case, right? It creates a supportive culture for folks to be able to push back around boundary violations. And then the third group of people I would qualify as being straight up predators. And I think these are folks who actively seek to harm because they like to, because it's enjoyable to them. I think it's a very small minority, but they do a disproportionate amount of damage. Thank you. And consent education might reach them, but they will use it as a tool to game the system. They'll pick up language to be able to get away with things more easily, right? And there is a slide between 2 and 3, and I think they can sometimes be hard to tell apart. And the problem is that everyone wants to be a number 1. Everyone wants to be in that first category. Some people in the number 2 category think they are and feel very victimized by being told they're not. And people in the third category might know they're not, but they want you to think they are because it helps them get away with things, right? So why are these categories even useful, and why am I talking about them? Mostly because I think they require different management strategies in the context of an event or a setting or a workplace. And I don't necessarily, I wish I had like a list of really great strategies to throw at you, but I think my argument here is less that I know all the answers and more that, that this means it's important to have multiple strategies in place, right? Because different things will work with different people. So just for instance, consent education is a great category for group number 1. Group number 2 might need a restorative justice process of some kind, and group number 3, you just need to fire them, right? Or put up safety boundaries to keep them out of the space, right? So different ways of approaching things. But you know who doesn't necessarily experience those 3 categories as having any meaningful difference? The people who have been harmed, right? Because regardless of where that harm is coming from, they still have experienced it as a consent violation, right? And so that brings me to sort of put forward the idea that I think it's really important, no matter what, to center survivors in whatever it is that we're doing, kink and elsewhere. You can see that what I'm talking about isn't super kinky, but it's also really kinky. So I can't give you a whole lecture on survivor support. It's a giant topic, but basically our entire society needs to get way, way better at doing this. And what I can talk about is how I see consent education working as part of survivor support. And mostly, I think the metaphor that came to mind is that it's kind of a herd immunity. What I mean by that is the more that you make consent and negotiation practices a part of any community or any gathering at all for any purpose, the more likely that the people in group number 1 will have better techniques to avoid harming people in the first place, which they never wanted to do. The people in group number 2 will be pushed to face their behavior and be given some tools to learn and develop and grow. And the people in group number 3 will have a lower likelihood of getting away with it, but mostly and most importantly, the survivors will have a system in place that is conditioned to believe and support them. And so I think consent practice sort of everywhere and all the time creates the conditions for broader social change. This is where I go back to like classic feminism and I say the personal is political. It really, really is. If you normalize consent practices in every damn thing you do, whether it's tying somebody up and spanking them or in your workplace or in your negotiation for a dinner date, all of these things create a structure of practice that teaches just by doing all the time in how you interact with the world. Janet Hardy, who's a well-known kink educator, writes that, that these techniques help us handle the currency of power. And when you practice handling the currency of power in your kink interactions or your sexual interactions, it actually can give you more tools to do that in your everyday life too, because they're not that separate. I would love to give you a couple of classic negotiation techniques, but I'm not sure I have time. How am I doing? I'm sort of out of time. Oh, I don't know. How much can you give me? Sure. I can do 2 minutes on consent. So, okay. So rather than give you like diagrams, which I do have, sorry, but rather than do that, I am going to talk about the 4 stages, if you will, of consent negotiation. And I would apply this to a kinky activity. So that's the example I will use, but you can obviously take this and bring it all over the place. So the very first thing that you need to do before you even negotiate anything with anybody is think about safety and think about technique, right? So for instance, I am not a bondage expert. I know how to tie some knots, I know how to do some harnesses and stuff, but I am not ready in my own knowledge to suspend somebody from a rafter. Right? That would be a level of danger that I can't reliably engage in because I don't have the skill yet. So if I really wanted to do that, I would be responsible then for going out and learning that thing and practicing it on probably some inanimate objects so that if they drop, they don't get hurt, right? Or at least maybe it's a pillow, I don't know, right? So there's this sort of prep level that you need to do for whatever you're about to engage in to make sure you can do it competently. The next step is also a pre-act step, and that's negotiation. And when I'm negotiating, When I'm negotiating with another human being to do a thing to them, I ask the following kinds of questions. What are your hard limits? So what is it that you absolutely don't want to do? No way, no how. Never touch my stomach. Don't touch my throat. Don't ever call me the following things. Those kinds of things where it's just not even negotiable. What are your desires? What do you want to experience here? What are you looking to have happen? Do you want this to be scripted or unscripted? So do you want to say, I only want you to do the following 3 things, and then I'll say, okay, I'll do those things? Or do you want to say, more or less we can do in the range of the following? All of these are okay, just not X, Y, or Z, right? So what kind of interaction is it going to be? How do you look and sound when you're having fun? How will I know from your body language and your vocalizations that you're enjoying yourself? And what should I look for to know that maybe you're not having fun? Do you go quiet? Do you get loud? What happens, right? And not everyone's going to know this right away, right? But if the more you practice, the more you'll know yourself and how you tend to react to things. And it can be super handy, for instance, because some people's reactions to heavy stimulus are not what you would think. So I had somebody once who said, if I start to cry, please keep going. That's an indication that I'm having an emotional release. It's really good for me. I love it. I'm happy. If I look at you like I want to kill you, that's not actually what's happening, but I've been told my face looks like that sometimes. I was like, holy crap, that's great, because I would have seen those signals and thought exactly the opposite. Now's the time to stop, right? So it was really handy for someone to be able to describe their own reactions. Another question is, how would you like to communicate? Do you want a safe word? Do you want to be able to yell grapefruits and now I know that I need to stop? Or do you just want to use the English language and say, okay, I need to stop now, right? Because in a role play scenario, you might not want to say no. You might want to be able to struggle and scream and have the person go ahead anyway. But not everything we do is role play, right? So it's not, a safe word is one technique, but it's not the only technique. And the last question is always, what are your aftercare needs? What do you need when we're done? Do you want to be left alone? Do you want a handshake? Do you want to snuggle for an hour? Do you want to have sex? Am I okay with that? Do you want me to call you tomorrow, or do you have somebody else you want to talk to? What happens after, right? So this is all before anything even happens. And it doesn't have to be pedantic and boring. This can be the sexiest kind of conversation ever. Just saying. And then you have the during, right? So this is part three, is now you're actually doing the thing. So you stick to your plan, you stick to your negotiations, you watch, you listen, you ask, and you communicate. And if you think something's going wrong, you stop. Because you, if you are in my position as a top, for instance, you also have the right to consent or withdraw your consent. Consent is not just for people on the receiving end, right? So anyone can call it off at any point, yourself included, yeah? But during this, you're not just executing, you're listening. You're looking for those signals we talked about, et cetera, right? And then afterwards, then we talk about aftercare. So this is, you do whatever the post-experience thing is that you agreed you were gonna do. You listen, you talk to each other, maybe you touch some more, maybe you're in contact, you know, right afterwards or later on. And the best part is that that's often the time where you get to reinforce the trust that you've built, reflect on the experience, and possibly do it all over again. So I hope this has been giving you some ideas to chew on. I don't, you know, theater is not bondage, therapy is not spanking. I get that these things don't all exactly mesh, but I do think that the broader concepts apply in a lot of places, and I thank you so much for your time.